All right, in this video, I'm going to walk you through the parts of this model here. This is a bisected skull, bisected head really, because it's not just a skull. So it's a pretty neat little model where we have kind of a partially dissected face, show some of those internal structures. We can see some of the stuff on the inside of the nose, the inside of the mouth, and then we can actually pull the model in half and see some of the different parts of those kind of internal structures. So right away, I'm going to kind of talk about this side of the face, which is very visible. Right along the cheek here, like we saw in our big torso model, is the very visible parotid gland with its duct that carries saliva from almost over by the ear into our oral cavity. It sits on top of the masseter muscle, which is visible inside of it, or deep to it. Okay, on the right side here, very visible, is the frontal sinus, which is above the eye socket, above the eye, and below it in the maxillary bone is the maxillary sinus. That's very visible, and this model has this little piece that comes out to illustrate it. Okay, I'll put that back in. Here's our eye, pretty much the same eye model as what's in the two torsos. You got the lacrimal gland up here, the superior rectus, the inferior rectus, lateral rectus, and then the medial rectus, and then the superior oblique and the inferior oblique. Okay, I'm going to take it out, leave it out. Very visible here are the ethmoid air cells, those sinuses really that open up into the nasal cavity, just like the frontal and the maxillary sinuses. Now, the nose on this fella is partially sectioned so that we can kind of see an open right nasal cavity, and then the left side is closed. It's a parasagittal section, which allows us to still see the visible nasal septum. If you remember, the nasal septum is what divides the left and right sides of the nasal cavity. So I'm going to now prop this fella open so that we can examine the inside of the nasal cavity. Okay, so along here on the right side, we have what would be on the lateral sides of the nasal cavity. And are very visible here are the three nasal conchae, superior, middle, and inferior. Okay, not hard to see whatsoever. Above the nasal cavity, you have the cribriform plate from the ethmoid bone that basically forms the superior part of the nasal cavity. Here we can once again see the frontal sinus. For the first time, we can finally see the sphenoid sinus, which is a opening within the sphenoid bone. Okay. If we kind of zoom in here, the inferior part of the nasal cavity and the superior part of the oral cavity formed by the hard palate, these bones here, palatine bone and the maxillary bone. And then 62, you can see the red in color representing muscle, illustrates the fact that this is the soft palate, a very important part of our oral cavity that allows for swallowing. And then extending down, you can see what number 63 is, which is our uvula, that hanging down ball structure. Okay. Number 61 here is that opening that comes from the eustachian tube in our ear, leads from the middle ear to our inner ear. Now, if I look down here, we have the tongue, which in this case we're showing the tongue is a solid mass of muscle, and then it has muscles that are considered to be extrinsic muscles that attach to other things to help move the tongue around, up and down, side to side, that kind of stuff. If I take the tongue out, it allows us to see some of the internal structures. Two of the very important glands that deliver saliva into our oral cavity. Number 68 here that I have my finger on is the sublingual gland. And then it's kind of misleading that it's kind of shown here in our other model. It actually was shown kind of down here where it was open. This is obviously closed so you can't see it. but number 66 is showing you the submandibular gland. Okay, let's kind of zoom in and get you a good view of it. Above 66 there, 64, we can see is one of the palatine tonsils. Okay. As you can see, this would be the fauces, which is the opening from the oral cavity. This would be the internal nares coming from the opening of the nose. And that would make this region right here the pharynx, specifically would be the oropharynx, which is what number 72 is showing you here. Now, as you pass down here, the pharynx is going to fork. Anteriorly, it's going to form into the larynx, which is what number 73 is illustrating. Larynx, which is made up of many cartilages that carries air into the trachea below, which is what number 81 is illustrating. The top of the larynx is guarded by a flap of tissue called the epiglottis, which is what number 74 is, and it is what prevents food and water from getting down into the larynx and will cause us to choke. Posteriorly, food and drink are going to pass into the esophagus, which is what number 84 is showing you there. Okay. So I can kind of show you there a little bit. It's a muscular tube, whereas both the trachea and the larynx are more rigid due to cartilages. So those are kind of the main structures that I want you to know in this side of our model. If I kind of turn over here, our model this time is showing you the nasal septum, as I was showing you a little bit ago. Up at the beginning here, 102 is our nasal vestibule. Excuse me, not the nasal vestibule. It is one of the cartilages. The nasal vestibule actually would be up in there, which is where sometimes people get that little piercing placed. As you can see, there's different cartilages that make up the nasal septum. The beginning, or about anterior half of the nasal septum, is all cartilage, whereas you get back towards the inside of the nasal cavity, we've got two different bones, the vomer inferiorly and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, that help to form the hard part or the bony part of the nasal septum. Once again, we can see the sphenoid sinus, the frontal sinus above, okay, hard palate, soft palate, and so on and so forth. Tongue on this side doesn't come out. We can see the esophagus, larynx, and the trachea again. And what I haven't mentioned really is the parts of the brain. And we have brain models that illustrate these pretty easily, so I don't really focus on those too much. What I do want to kind of point out, though, is what number 192 is showing you. So kind of the first time we've seen this, that's the falx cerebri, which is an extension of the dura mater that separates the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. So that's kind of cool. Our other models don't really get to show you that, and that's kind of neat for that reason. Right here, this kind of extension, and it's not really labeled, would be the tentorium cerebelli, which is actually what separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum, and also not shown would be the falx cerebelli that would separate the two lobes or two hemispheres of the cerebellum. All right, so I think I've pretty much covered what I want you to know on this model, so we'll stop right here. Thanks.